approach would be more a long-term need. And then what INEE is trying to establish is that these two fields need to be bridged. Then there's a security box over there as well. And here it's called security and peace building. And this is also where another field of work comes in. And in this particular report, the security field is also referred to ministries of defense, the military operations, civil military initiatives. And some of the work of my colleague Mario Novelli from the University of Sussex also highlighted that this interconnection with the security sector is also not unproblematic. And this is what sometimes is referred to as the 3D approach, where you combine defense, diplomacy, and development. And also in that order: defense, much more money; diplomacy, still relatively high on the agenda; and development, which is often seen as kind of less importance in national states' agendas. So it's not unproblematic, or in a way it's slightly problematic. Also, as we have seen, that aid workers or colleagues working in humanitarian aid sector have faced difficulties because of this intermingling of military operations together with development operations. And there have been attacks also on people working in the humanitarian phase and also in the development phase. And then finally there's the sector of disaster risk reduction, DRR. And this is an interesting phase for education specifically, because this is where we look into prevention and preparedness. So education can play a role in making sure that populations, students as well as communities, are aware of certain risks, natural disasters, but it could also expand beyond human-made disasters, and to work on this prevention phase. So there's in a way different kind of time focuses: the shorter term, the longer term, the prevention, and the security, the integrated approach. And then this is the last slide I'll say something about. And here we see that there are three main discourses, or three main narratives in the field. And in a way, these discourses also are connected somewhat to the timeline of the field of education in emergencies that really started to come about after the 2000s. So education in emergencies, the first one, which is on the top, has this approach of doing no harm, making sure that in a situation of emergency, education is prioritized, that there is advocacy undertaken to make sure there is enough funding, and that when education in emergency situations is implemented, is established, that it is doing no harm. In a way, this narrative, this idea then developed into what was called conflict-sensitive education. And the next session in the program is going to speak in much more detail around this, and our colleague Taro and others will say more about this in detail. Basically what we could say, and this is based on the work of Professor Alan Smith and Christine Allison Smith that came up with this table behind me, is that where education in emergencies is about doing no harm, the conflict-sensitive education in a way is about doing good. So it's not only about avoiding risk, but it's actually about doing, so how can we make education more sensitive towards conflict situations? How can we understand conflict situations? And then the final narrative or discourse that's presented here is around education and peace building. And this is also a field of research that I've been involved with myself a bit more over the past years, also in collaboration with a number of colleagues, including Mario Novelli and Alan Smith and a range of others. And UNICEF has also played quite a big role in establishing this focus on peace building. And what this last narrative looks at, it's it's actually a build-up. It's both doing no harm, it's also doing good, but it's also around transformations. So peace building, and this is where we look at education not only as a sector in itself, but as a sector that is very much connected to economic reforms, to political reforms, to social cultural processes of inclusion, exclusion in society. So seeing education as connected to all of these broader processes of peace building. Now, that's probably enough kind of throwing information at you for a moment. So what we'll do now, very briefly before I turn back to Mary, is because we're all here in this room with very different starting points of discussion. Some of us have this as our daily lives and we can live and dream these words. And when I'm working with my students, I often tell them, when you're working in this field, you need to be prepared to eat your alphabet soup. And what this means, in a way, is that alphabet soup is working in this field. There's a lot of abbreviations. DDR, INEE, all these abbreviations. So there's also a lot of terms that we're throwing at you. So what we wanted to do is take just a brief moment for what we call a buzz. So this is a 2-minute buzz, maybe 3 minutes. And a buzz is basically to look around you, find 2 or 3 people around you, and we're going to have a brief discussion, rather than us telling you definitions, just to have a brief discussion around 4 concepts that we feel were good to have some common ground on. First one is emergencies. What do we mean when we say emergencies?
Não sei se querem traduzir aqui rapidamente, vamos ter aqui pequeno exercício de participação vossa, não é? Primeiro, para discutirem o primeiro conceito, emergências, o que é?
The second one is conflict. Conflicto. What do we mean with conflict? Then the third one is peace building. What do we mean when we say peace building? And then
Peace building, construção da paz, talvez bastante relevante para alguns dos contextos dos nossos também estudantes.
And the last one is, what do we mean when we say education? Educação. Right? So for some of us, these concepts might be really duh, but honestly, it's quite interesting for us to start at the same page today, to have a brief discussion. Now, we're going to have a trick, rather than us saying after a while, and we're going to do the hands up. So whenever you see one of us and people around you putting your hand up in the air, the idea is that everyone follows. So in the end, you'll have a whole room with people with their hand up in the air, and this will be our sign to kind of get back to the plenary. So then we don't have to shout, and we'll just put our hands in the air. So we're going to look at emergencies, conflict, peace building and education, a short buzz with those of you around you, preferably people that you have not spoken to before. Okay, go ahead.
Podem se juntar com pessoas que vocês não conhecem, não é? Talvez ainda estes conceitos. Quando terminarem, vamos toda a gente dessa uma entrada, acabou a sessão.
It's slowly starting to work, hands up, but we need to practice this skill. So hands up means, oh, okay, we need to actually be silent and focus our attention back to the plenary. Thanks. So just for you, if you've heard this kind of knocking sound all the time, it wasn't us kind of kicking the table or knocking the microphone. This was actually a sign of our colleagues online, hi everyone online, because there's 20 plus colleagues also joining this discussion online, and it was them typing comments and questions. So we've shut out the sound.
Só para dizer que começámos a estranhar colegas em várias partes do mundo, incluindo amigos na Jordânia, em várias partes, a seguir este tipo de a colocarem também, fazerem comentário.
And we also, yeah, exactly. Thanks for joining. And we could also see that there was an online discussion as well going on. So we're not going to spend too much time on these concepts, but just for each of the four, if we could have one group just sharing their discussion, maybe the first one on emergencies. Is there someone who would like to share the reflections in the group on emergencies, please? Yes, please. There's a microphone.
Janelle, it's for the simulcast. The mic for the folks online. Okay, yes, it's working. We had a discussion in Spanish, Portuguese, and talked about emergencies and how the concept of emergencies has changed and has kind of blossomed into something more than just the discussion of an emergency being that there was before maybe a war or a conflict, right? And that now, as was mentioned, we look more at a natural disaster, but even beyond that, now an emergency is also when there's very high levels of violence that impede society or that are stopping regular structures from functioning in governments, etc.
Thank you. Also, if you would want to share your discussion in Portuguese, that's fine, and then Minho can provide a translation. You're doing very well so far. So, conflict. The next one. Is there someone who would like to share reflections from their group on this idea of conflict? Did you get to discussing conflict? No, we also were stuck with it.
Like this.
No reflection. What's interesting, what usually comes up when discussing conflict is that when we think of conflict, we often think of something negative, right? Conflict is something where there's different forms of violence: direct physical violence, structural violence, discrimination, exclusion, armed violence. Interestingly enough, some of the authors, like Lynn Davies, a professor in the field of education and emergencies, writes about the relationship between conflict and education as also a potential positive form of conflict, where conflict can actually provide the grounds for standing up, for speaking up, what she calls interruptive democracy in classrooms. And positive forms of conflict would be non-violent, but it would be around changing the status quo. So that's just a reflection on conflict. Anyone on peace building? If you didn't get to conflict, I would be surprised that you would fight peace building. No? We're missing, yes please, there's a hand up. I was just going to say there's a hand up in the middle, there's a microphone. Yeah, gentleman in the orange shirt.
Well, we were discussing the concept of peace building, including social justice, that's to say. There is, peace building does not only imply that there might be the awareness of the world, that the need for social justice. This will involve ideological conflict, etc. The world displaced people who need to be taken care of. There's different countries, neighboring countries trying to take advantage of resources from other countries, etc. This building has to do with talking about what makes a peaceful context for sites.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think there's also in the literature now more understanding of this connection between peace building and social justice, indeed. So thank you for referring to that. And the final one, education. Did anyone had this was actually online. I saw there was a comment on education. I just thought it was a comment. I can't tell you what it was. I'm sure if we can, looking at picture, if we can find it back. No, let's see. Anyway, when we are saying education, generally speaking, within the INEE and within the broader field, it's a broad understanding of education. It's both formal education within schools, but it's also non-formal forms of education provided through non-governmental institutions outside of institutionalized school settings, etc. So it's a broad understanding of learning spaces in a way. I'm going to hand over back to Mary.
Thank you. So what we're going to do now is, in terms of having a shared understanding of the field of education and emergencies, we have tried to map the field on one PowerPoint slide. It is inherently flawed. It is meant to stimulate your thinking and will give you a chance to respond to some of the gaps or some of the things you think are missing on this map. And it's meant to be kind of unfinished and incomplete, so lots of caveats before we present this. And at the same time, things are presented in categories. Do not think that those are neat categories. There's a lot of blending and merging and cyclical nature of the work that we do. And I'll try to point that out a little bit as we go, but I just wanted to make sure we don't walk away thinking that this is the way things are, because it's never that neat. So first we can think about types of crisis, and I think Janella started to get at this already in her small group discussion. We talk about armed conflict and different levels of violence. We talk about natural disasters, and we're also talking about pandemics, thinking about the Ebola crisis in West Africa and what that meant for the education system in that part of the world. And we can certainly cite other examples across this spectrum. We also think then about the response on the humanitarian and the development side of things. We talk about prevention and preparedness, which Mika spoke to earlier, the immediate response to the acute crisis as things start to stabilize, the recovery period, and then post-crisis reconstruction and kind of moving into longer-term development goals. And just to reiterate the point that these are not neat categories and that this is not linear. You see my squiggle here. So there's constant kind of recurrent conflict, and there might be recurrent conflict in an otherwise stable country, but kind of limited to one part of the country. And so just to remember that, and I'll get rid of my squiggle now, but just to kind of emphasize that fact. And then we think about the different populations that we might be working with. And again, these aren't exclusive categories, and a lot of heterogeneity within each. We've talked about refugees, we've talked about internally displaced persons who aren't leaving their country, but they've been displaced from their home communities. We talk about non-migrants, those who've stayed and kind of ridden out the conflict or the crisis, and those who have left, either internally displaced or refugees who are now coming home. So thinking about different populations that we might be working with, sometimes all of those at the same time in the same place. And then, of course, we're talking about education, and we're talking about both non-formal education and formal education, and across the lifespan, so everything from early childhood through tertiary, with increasing attention being paid to the upper levels of the education pipeline. And then kind of picking up on these approaches we talked about earlier from the literature, thinking about the human rights-based approaches and the protection approaches that we take to the work that we do, upholding not only the right to education, but other rights, the rights to mobility, the rights to work, perhaps. There are a number, of course, listed in the different human rights and legal frameworks. We talk about conflict sensitivity and how we can further embrace conflict-sensitive approaches to the work we're doing in education, and being really mindful about the decisions that we make around recruiting teachers, around the curriculum that we're teaching, around the hiring of staff, in terms of our conflict sensitivity, and of course peace building, which Minho also talked about. And all of these things are going to inform the different types of programs and interventions that we might have in the education emergencies field. And again, these are big boxes of categories. They are not mutually exclusive. There's a lot of moving back and forth. But we can think about access and inclusion, right? So those who've been disrupted, their lives have been disrupted. Maybe they've never been to school, in fact, trying to create access points and inclusion points for these young people. So we can think of UNICEF School in a Box, where in the kind of immediate response to the crisis, trying to get some stability back in these young people's lives, getting access to some play materials and some really basic teaching and learning materials. We think of school construction and reconstruction. We think about these inclusive opportunities around gender, around disabilities, around language support in multilingual settings. Again, we can think about accelerated education programs, so those who maybe have missed out or have had such extended disruptive schooling, how can we help them catch up and hopefully walk away with some type of certified learning opportunity. Increasingly, we're hearing about how we can leverage ICT, information communication technologies, to extend access, particularly to those hardest to reach in these different settings. We can also think about protection, right? It's a big part of what we do in education and emergencies. So by establishing safe learning environments, by providing psychosocial support and socio-emotional learning, thinking about how we can prepare young people for livelihoods and skills training so that they can earn a living and help themselves and their families in the process. And more work now focused on preventing violent extremism and what's happening in different parts of the world today, and kind of vulnerable youth that are being exposed to these different influences. So with the psychosocial support, for example, we might think of the International Rescue Committee's Healing Classrooms initiative, where they're not only trying to bolster literacy and numeracy skills, but they're also being very mindful of the psychosocial well-being of the kids and helping them pay kind of equal measure to both the academics and the socio-emotional learning opportunities that are presented. And then lastly, quality, a really big push. It's not just enough to get kids back into school. Are they actually learning? What are they learning? And so thinking about how we can support the teachers that are recruited, perhaps from the same displaced community or from the national community, to lend support to these young people. Obviously thinking about literacy and numeracy and making sure folks are getting the minimum that they need to be able to survive in the world and take care of themselves, but then really building on that in terms of academic subject knowledge or content knowledge. Thinking about these broader life skills that they might need. And of course thinking again about what are they actually learning and can we certify it? Can they walk away with a credential that has value and meaning, whether they stay where they are or they move to other countries? And so these are just some examples. Again, in this category, we might think of Save the Children's Literacy Boost that has a very intensive literacy focus, but also heavy participation by the community in which they're working to make sure that they have more of a holistic effort to boosting the literacy skills. And of course, these are kind of program-specific examples, but through all of these, we're also talking about advocacy, raising the concerns about the right to education, the policy-making process to make sure that teachers and students are walking away with certifications that are recognized, the research that goes into building the evidence base about what works and what doesn't work, and then of course system strengthening, which is an increasing part of what we're doing, and those ties between the humanitarian field and the development field. So this is one very humble attempt to map the field in one PowerPoint slide. Of course, this is Incomplete, again, there's a lot of movement across. You might be doing things that cover, of course, access, inclusion, and protection and quality all at the same time. This is just kind of one way to help group things and think about things. And again, looking at these lower levels of types of crisis and the response and the different populations, all of that could be in flux at the same time. So you might think you're in a recovery period and then it goes back into the crisis mode and then moves ahead to longer term kind of post-crisis reconstruction. So this constant fluctuation of how we're responding and providing support to the field of education emergencies. So just being mindful that again, it's never linear, almost never linear, and that there's a lot of movement and connections across all of these efforts. And so this, again, is one way to kind of stimulate your thinking about the field of education emergencies. And what we'd like to do is have you kind of go back into those smaller groups and reflect on this map a little bit. And think about, and I'll put the map back up in a second, but think about what's missing. What is not accounted for here that we need to kind of keep in our minds as we move through the day. And if there's anything that you do not think should be on this map, to flag that as well. And before Julio translates, we're going to come around and give you index cards so you can jot these down. You might, inundate us with lots of changes you want to make to the map. But we'll come around and collect your thoughts, and then we'll come back together with hands up for preliminary discussion. Yeah? Would you like to translate?
Posso tentar, portanto, agora o que, depois desta apresentação tão rica da complexidade desta área também, seria voltarmos um bocadinho aos grupos de discussão. A pergunta, o que é que falta? O que é que falta aqui neste mapa aqui? Ou o que é que não deveria lá estar também, não é? Para agora continuarmos a discussão. Por isso, basicamente, eu resumo agora, portanto, está do vosso lado outra vez agora. Bola. Portanto, vão ser distribuídos, peço desculpa, vão ser distribuídos os cartões para escreverem depois o que é que falta de gaps, as lacunas nesta área, para escreverem.
Don't write a dissertation.
Não é para escrever uma dissertação, mas pode ajudar.
Just some keywords and we'll collect them. So just for now, think of the gaps. What would you want to add to the map? And if there's anything you want to take away from the map. And I'll put the map back up now. So let's do that for about 5 minutes. Yeah? So we won't be able to go through all of the cards because we have just a couple more questions for you that we'd like to ask in the open plenary. But just to point out a few examples here, as we think about types of crisis, a group pointed out, gang and youth violence as a particularly important area that we should add in here. They also talk about EIE actors. We weren't able to squish that into the slide, but we have a whole list of the different stakeholders, the key groups and constituencies that we need to work with, from the donors to the UN, to the NGOs, to the communities, to the parents, the students, who else was I thinking in there? Increasingly private sector. So thinking about those really different stakeholders and the heterogeneity within those that we need to be mindful of. Other suggestions were around, to better encapsulate skills learning and life learning, both informal and formal opportunities. Perhaps DRR could be better, so disaster risk reduction could be better captured here. And we have others here. Adult education, so thinking about our older learners. And what we need for lifelong learning opportunities. So I think maybe we'll have to stop there because we're going to run out of time with this session, but we'll maybe figure out a way to type these up and share them back to Julio. But thank you for engaging with that and helping us kind of fill out the map a bit more. But before we conclude, we had a couple other questions for you, and we'll take both of them together just to continue the discussion before we need to move to the next, or to the coffee break perhaps. So no coffee break, keep working. So the two questions we had are, so we talked about the gaps on the map, but if we could kind of step back beyond the map and just think about the larger field of education emergencies and what we know about it from whatever our starting points are today. What are the current gaps in current practices and programs, or research needs, or policy-making priorities that you think we need to be mindful of, or that you see on the horizon for becoming increasingly important in the future. And also, again, to Julio's introduction earlier, a real opportunity for our Lusophone colleagues, not only working in Lusophone countries, but also other countries that are dealing with education and emergencies challenges, what advice, guidance, recommendations we might have for them as they continue to strengthen and expand their contributions to the field. So you can choose which of those questions you'd like to answer, and maybe Julio can translate for us.
Sim, uma pequena tradução. A primeira pergunta, como já vimos, era o que é que faltava aqui neste mapa, não é? A segunda questão era quais as lacunas nas políticas, nas práticas e ou na investigação também, que esta área ainda tem. E a terceira questão era uma questão sobre que recomendações para nós, para os nossos colegas, para as universidades dos países lusófonos, também aqui que estão aqui ligados à universidade e outros colegas que estão a considerar ou a repensar, a considerar trabalhar nesta área e que contributos é que podemos dar também na área de educação de emergências, pensando, e agora olhando ali para a doutora Helena que está cá, que tem sempre batalhado por esta questão do papel da educação superior também nas emergências. Qual é o nosso papel? Como é que a universidade e a educação superior também deve estar preparada e responder e conhecer bem esta área?
So if we have microphones, yeah, and people would like to raise their hands, and I know we have some questions coming in online as well, we can try to field some of those. So what questions do you have, or answers to these questions do you have? Yes, you have one.
And maybe it's nice if you introduce yourself to the group.
In Portuguese.
Hello. My name is Mark Chappell. I work with the World Division in the Syria Crisis Response Region. In terms of current gaps for research, evidence building, I think we're really, given the prominence now in ICT and the emerging practice in mobile education, really needing some evidence base behind what's working, what isn't working, and then how we can take what is working to scale.
I know there are more ideas in the room.
Podem fazer os comentários em português e depois fazemos aqui alguma tradução improvisada. Fiquem à vontade. Se me permitem, só dizer que eu acho que quando se coloca esta questão do contributo.
I'm just going to have a brief note in Portuguese. I think it's very important. Eu diria que este é particularmente relevante a última pergunta, em que pedem um pouco o contributo das nossas realidades e do nosso conhecimento enquanto pessoas que trabalham, que se expressam e que são originalmente falantes de língua portuguesa. Eu acho que, sobretudo, esta última pergunta, podemos partilhar aqui algumas experiências e preocupação. Eu acho que realmente devíamos aproveitar esta oportunidade, desculpa estar aqui a fazer este forcing, acho que era extremamente relevante que trouxéssemos agora a nossa experiência para aqui e podemos fazê-lo em português com.
O mais tímido, mas ele vai falar agora.
Eu sou angolano e venho de um país que sofreu uma guerra terrível, uma guerra fratricida entre irmãos, não é? A nossa guerra foi logo após a independência, de 75 até 91, depois de 92 retomou até 2002, para dizer que é um país que está em paz há 15 anos. O que tem faltado muitas vezes, o contributo que a escola deveria dar era incluir no currículo algo que se relacionasse com a reconciliação nacional e sim, reconciliação nacional era importante, porque os políticos fizeram, em 92 houve um acordo de paz que culminou com as eleições, mas depois constituiu-se o governo de unidade e reconciliação nacional. Isso levou um ano. Não basta.
the other side again, the language. Matthias is from Angola, and his concern is about curriculum and on the importance of including reconciliation, reconciliation, you said, in the curriculum. And I think his PhD will be guided by his concept of reconciliation, you know, reconstruction versus reconciliation. Yeah?
Pois, não há um tempo limitado para a reconciliação. A reconciliação é algo que deve ser para sempre. É uma reconstrução ou construção diária. Como se faz, a paz não se faz em um dia. Porque às vezes nós colocamos tempo, o tempo de paz deve ser de 5, 6 anos. Isso não existe. É uma falsa ideia. Constrói-se a paz todos os dias. E então terminou a guerra de armas, mas tem o conflito podemos ideológico, o conflito de ideias, interesses. Por isso que é preciso que a escola trabalhe para também terminar com estes conflitos todos.
Foi só o debate iniciou-se aqui conosco, porque esta semana foi comemorado 15 anos de paz em Angola, e nós lemos dia 4 de abril, e isso foi mote para debatermos a questão do tema.
Yeah, again, this is related to the context of Angola, 15 years of celebrating peace agreement in Angola. But as Matthias tried to explain, reconciliation takes time. You need time. It's not a question of that the conflict is over, ended, but there is ideological conflict as well, and education has to deal with this. This needs to be treated in terms of policy, in terms of curriculum options. So the keywords are reconciliation, time, context. Matthias is doing his PhD on education in rural areas and how curriculum will affecting particular choices in Angola in the time of this construction.
So we're almost approaching the coffee break hour. So I'll just say a few brief words, and also to mention that I'm sure that there are many more ideas in the audience. So this session was really just to wake ourselves up, and the rest of the day we can continue these discussions. Just a few closing words. From the comments that came from the audience, also formally mentioning the connection between social justice and peace building, and the recent reference to reconciliation, I just briefly wanted to mention that in relation to the research consortium that I was recently involved in, the research consortium on education and peace building, we developed an analytical framework which was called the 4 R's, which is actually a social justice lens to looking at issues of redistribution in education. So that's economic dimension of injustices. Then recognition, social cultural recognition, which also deals a lot with content and curriculum. Representation, political dimension, political injustices, our teachers, our youth heard in political decision making around education. And then the 4th R in the model is reconciliation. And how does education deal with the past? How is education connected to truth and reconciliation processes in wider society? I'm very happy to speak more about this in the break to any of you if you're interested. But thank you very much for all your participation and questions, and I hope we can continue this fruitful discussion for the rest of the day. And I'm just handing over to Mary.
No, I think it's time for that coffee break, and it'll be good to exchange ideas around the 4 R's, or you're going to learn in the next session about the conflict sensitivity approach that would also be applicable to thinking about curriculum development and revitalization in Angola and other places. And also you have people here who've been working in different contexts doing similar work, and so to benefit from those lessons learned in that process. And so that's why it's great to have the coffee breaks and the lunch hour to do that networking and to generate ideas and some opportunities to collaborate together. So again, yeah, hopefully you stimulated your thinking, and now you have a session on teaching, on research, and on partnerships the rest of the day to really help tease out these ideas even more. So thank you very much for your time this morning.
Just some words in Portuguese first. Temos coffee break, estamos aqui todos impreterivelmente, estamos a funcionar como um relógio suíço às 11h30 para mantermos o tempo. Há uma exposição de materiais e também uma colega de Bibliothèque Sans Frontières, Libraries Without Borders, vai apresentar uma aplicação, vai fazer uma demonstração de uma aplicação para termos acesso à integração. So, coffee break now, half an hour, on the right there, yeah, and there will be our friend and colleague from Bibliothèque Sans Frontières is going to present an app on
Okay, good afternoon or good morning still. Good morning, yes. I hope you guys had a nice coffee break. Shall we start? Yes. I know that some people have to leave in the afternoon, those of you coming from abroad, so I was told by Julio that we have to keep it to time. My name is Taro Komatsu from Sophia University in Japan. Sofia, but in Tokyo, not in Bulgaria. And I don't speak Portuguese language, although I found that our word for thank you sounds very similar. You say obrigado, we say arigato. Feels like we have already finished the session, but no. In this second session, based on what we discussed in the first session, which dealt with the key concepts around education emergencies. In the second session, we'll be focusing on conflict-sensitive education, which is essentially the approach to programs and policies that aims to minimize the negative impacts of those programs and maximize positive impacts of those programs and policies. We have 4 presentators, starting with the 2 presentations dealing mostly about concepts and ideas of conflict-sensitive education, followed by 2 concrete cases that incorporated conflict-sensitive education approaches and strategies and concepts. So without delay, let's start. Perhaps after each presentation, I could invite 1 or 2 questions. Then after all 4 questions are over, once again I'll give a floor, in which case during that time you could maybe pose a question that could address to multiple presentations. Okay? Good. So so we'll start with the presentation by Ms. Nina Wensin-Hong from ESID. The title is Introduction to Conflict-Sensitive Education and the CSE pack materials and upcoming training opportunities. Right.
Great. Thank you very much, Taro. Can you all hear me okay? Yeah. Okay, great. As Taro said, my name is Nina Weisenhorn and I am with the U.S. Agency for International Development. I'm also the co-chair of the INEE Education Policy Working Group and work across the Education Policy Working Group and the Standards and Practice Working Group to co-chair with my colleague Annie Smiley, the Conflict-Sensitive Education Sub-Working Group. So I have been asked to present this morning on the work that INEE has been doing for a number of years on conflict-sensitive education. As we saw this morning, next slide. Great. As we saw this morning in the presentation from Mary, I won't go into these details too much, but obviously conflict is a major barrier to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals and education for all, with 65 million children who have their education interrupted or affected by conflict. And so within this context, we know that conflict is also reinforcing inequities both at a global scale but also within any given region or specific countries, and often is exacerbating inequities that exist and may have been underlying causes of conflict. And in the Bush and Sartorelli piece, seminal work really framed education as in a complex environment, calling it the two faces of education. And this really means that, while we know that education is explicitly interrupted and children, teachers, educators, and education systems are disrupted during this time, as we're seeing in Syria, we've seen in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, Iraq, and many other places around the world. There's also an aspect about how has education itself contributed to conflict. For example, are there attitudes, behaviors, and practices that are explicitly either excluding children's access to education, excluding certain groups from being teachers and working in the education system, or reinforcing perceptions and ideologies through the curriculum or through instructional practices. But at the same time, we know that education, if done well, can also contribute to promoting tolerance, promoting inclusion, and preparing the next generation of children to respect the values and ideologies and kind of a global pluralism. And we've seen this in places such as Rwanda following the genocide, where peace-building curricula and instructional practices were promoting respect and national identity. We've seen it in places like Guatemala through the peace accords that have included commitments to extend bilingual education to indigenous populations, and aiming to also teach against exclusion. Clearly, this is popular online. This is great. Please keep your comments coming, and I hope that Peter will help us to share those comments. And so this is the context under which we have developed this framework that Mika also introduced earlier of conflict-sensitive education. How do we take in these two faces of education and understand how to then move forward so as to not exacerbate these kinds of inequities and further drivers of conflict or crisis more generally? And so how do we do that? Next slide. The conflict-sensitive education paradigm is really situated around three main principles. It's a three-step process, and it's really about an approach and a process to delivering education and working in this space. It's not going to dictate what you do, but really talking about how you do it. So the first step, which might be a bit hard to read on the slide, is about understanding the conflict context or the crisis context. And thinking about the slide and the framework that Mary showed earlier, while we call this conflict-sensitive education, I want to also encourage us to think about it as crisis-sensitive, that it's not just conflict that can be affected, and we need to understand the multiple risks that may be inherent in an environment, understand the root causes of those risks of the conflict, and how they're interacting with other risks in the environment, be they environmental, be they protection risks, health risks, livelihoods. And so in order to understand the conflict context, there are a variety of strategies and tools that help us do this. At USAID, we have the Rapid Education Risk Analysis tool. There are also political economy analysis and other frameworks that can be used to understand the conflict context in which we're working. However, understanding the context in which we're working is only the first step. The second step is about understanding that two-way interaction between the education system and the conflict, and understanding that it's a bi-directional relationship that exists between the education system, its actors, and the various components of education, and this conflict or risk environment. So looking at to what extent are education programs, policies, or practices having an interaction with the conflict. And then the last step is really acting to make sure to minimize any negative impacts and maximize the positive impacts that education policies and programs are having on the conflict. And really getting at what we were speaking to earlier on the principle of do no harm. And so in order to help and facilitate this process, next slide, the INEE has developed a conflict-sensitive education pack here. And this packet has been developed in English, translated into Arabic, French, and Spanish. And each of the components are in the process of also translation into Portuguese, which is all of the main languages of INEE. So the first piece of the pack is the conflict-sensitive education guidance note. Next slide. And the guidance note is really designed to help both governments as well as humanitarian aid workers, development actors, to have the tools to increase access to safe and relevant education opportunities. And this guide has been conveniently organized around the INEE minimum standards framework. So each of the 5 domains of the INEE minimum standards include guidance and practical case studies about how do you provide conflict-sensitive education in terms of access and learning environment, the foundational standards, teaching and learning, teachers and other education personnel, as well as education policy. Next slide. The pack also includes the guiding principles, and so this is really kind of a one view of the kind of 6 main aspects of conflict-sensitive education that again, policymakers and practitioners should be keeping in mind as they develop, design, and implement their programs and policies. And then, and the guiding principles, next slide, are again aligned to a 6-step or 6-principle process. The first one being on access, on assessing the environment. So conducting your conflict and education analysis. The second step or second principle being based on doing no harm in order to reduce the risks of exacerbating conflict. The third is focused on prioritizing prevention. The fourth is on promoting equity and holistic development of the child as a citizen, which I think links very well to the framework of the Sustainable Development Goals, which Leonora will speak about next. The fifth principle is on stabilize, rebuild, or build the education system, knowing that the process of systems building also needs to use a conflict-sensitive approach. And then finally, the last principle is on how development partners should act fast, respond to change, and stay engaged beyond the short-term support. So understanding that conflict-sensitive education is not something that you simply write into a proposal or write the curriculum and write the textbook and then your job is done. But in fact, you have to be constantly monitoring and evaluating and the process in which your program is being implemented, how the policy is playing out, to be able to adjust and adapt, because both your implementation is going to change, but the contextual environment and the conflict setting in which you're working, whether it's through reconstruction and reconciliation, or whether you're in the midst of conflict or a crisis, but this is a fluid environment, which again, Mary spoke about this morning. And so in taking a conflict-sensitive approach, it's not just a check the box once and done approach, but in fact something that is an ongoing process and integrated into every step of program implementation, as well as the evaluation and processes and choices you make in evaluating your programs. Next slide. The last tool is a reflection tool. And this reflection tool is a really practical resource for practitioners or policymakers to then delve into more specific questions on each of the guiding principles, again, organized around the INEE minimum standards, where you can ask yourself, your organization, and work through what are the actionable steps you are going to be taking in your program to address the different aspects of education in a conflict-sensitive way. So I'm not sure, do we have available materials?
Yeah, outside.
Okay, there might be a few materials available if you want to look through them, maybe only 4. So again, next slide. Again, this reflection tool is organized around each of the main areas of the INEE minimum standards and provides more specific questions on how to really assess and reflect on practice and implementation of your programs. And then this pack in the kind of true principles of INEE was developed in a multi-agency way and has contributed to collaboration and application of these resources as well as development of other resources. So next slide. And so this has included, the pack also has available a 90-minute or a 2-day training session so that with really practical training tools and guidance notes for a facilitator to take this information and bring it into their organization and train your colleagues on how to take a conflict-sensitive education approach. It's been piloted in Liberia and with the Harvard University, as well as 55 different organizations around the globe that have implemented the pack. In addition, there's been other materials that have been developed in coordination, including with UNESCO IIE Peace, with support from Peace, and the Program on Conflict-Sensitive Education Planning, Policy and Curriculum. USAID has developed a conflict-sensitive education checklist, and other donors such as the Global Partnership for Education, ECHO, have integrated conflict and fragility analysis into their education sector planning processes or development phases. And before I close, I also want to share that we have a number of great opportunities coming up for practitioners in the field and policymakers to participate in future training. This includes a training of trainers that we'll be hosting in the Middle East, end of June, beginning of July 2017. So please look for that on the INEE website. We're excited to have 9 anchor organizations who will then be taking this training pack back into their countries to do a contextualization and application workshops, which will be carried out between July and October of this year across the Middle East and East Africa. And then we also have the opportunity collaborating with the USAID Education in Crisis and Conflict Network and their community of practice, which is developing an online conflict-sensitive education module so that it can be used in an asynchronous way or integrated into other professional development plans that you may have in your organization or with other groups that you work with. So with that, please, I encourage you to go to INEE's website and to find the resources available. The full kit that I've presented here today is online, all of the training modules, as well as a presentation that walks you through some of the same information I've shared today. So, thank you.
Thank you, Nina. Nina referred to minimum standards, but is there anybody who does not know what they are? Should I minimum standards are the sort of guidelines that the INEE produced years ago that guide practitioners to deliver quality education in emergency context, and conflict-sensitive education pack is built on those standards. And we have actually a booklet like this that describes those standards. And I think it's downloadable also from the internet of the website of the INEE. Given the time constraints, maybe we could invite second presentator to deliver a presentation. Thank you. This is actually the minimum standards Portuguese version, right? Okay. Then invite a couple questions and clarifications, so if it's okay. Okay. So second presenter is Ms. Leonora McEwen, sorry, from the UNESCO IAP, International
Institute for Educational Planning.
Thank you very much. All right.
Great. Thank you, everyone, and good morning. So, as Taro said, I am Leonora McEwen from UNESCO's International Institute for Educational Planning. We're an institute, a technical capacity development institute that supports ministries of education to develop education sector plans. And I've had the privilege to work with ministries of education in countries including South Sudan, Chad, Burkina Faso to ensure that some of the principles that Nina discussed and presented are integrated into their sector plans so that there's prevention built into planning that occurs at the ministry level. So today I'm going to quickly, well, I'm not quickly, I'm going to take the time that I need but I won't keep you all day. So, to discuss briefly at the beginning of the presentation how education is really central to the SDGs, which places education higher on the international agenda. And I'll present some of the key features and their implications of the education agenda and try to kind of demonstrate that really this agenda is an opening and an opportunity really for content-sensitive education. Next slide, please. So before that, I just want to quickly give a little bit of the context in which the SDGs were developed. So the 21st century, our world is essentially characterized by three really paradoxical development trends. There's greater wealth, but rising vulnerability and inequality. So even though global poverty rates have been reduced by half since 2000, we still observe low employment growth, declining job quality, and increasing vulnerability. There are also increasing inequalities across, but particularly within countries. And at the global level, wealth is more concentrated in the hands of few. 50% of the world's wealth is in the hands of only 1% of the world's population. These trends and these factors, tensions, undermine social cohesion in all societies across the world. So we've also witnessed a second trend around economic, but also demographic growth. But that has been accompanied by increasing ecological stress and unsustainable patterns of consumption and production. The world population has tripled between 1950 and 2000. Water and food consumption has increased by more than two times between 1916 and 2000. And wood consumption has increased by 3 times. And then there's also the phenomenon of urbanization and the expansion of middle-class lifestyle that has led to the depletion of non-renewable natural resources and to climate change. And finally, another phenomenon that we've observed is the growing interconnectedness and interdependence that is coupled with, unfortunately, rising intolerance and conflict. So the expansion of internet connectivity, mobile technology and digital media has reduced time and space really for human relations and changes, unfortunately, every facet of our lives. And youth today are the most interconnected and the most informed generation in the history of the world. But as I mentioned, there are increasing levels of violence and violence. So next slide, please. So it's against this backdrop of the paradoxical global development trends that the SDGs reaffirm a humanistic approach to education and development. This approach has a central concern for sustainable development, one in which economic growth is guided by environmental stewardship and a concern of social justice. The approach recognizes the diversity of realities, of worldviews, and of conceptions of human well-being, while reaffirming a common core of universal ethical values, including respect for life and human dignity, equal rights and social justice, respect for cultural and social diversity, and also a sense of shared responsibility and commitment to international solidarity for our common future. So in this perspective, the purpose of education today must be to sustain and enhance the dignity, the capacity, and the welfare of people in relation to others and to nature. So it's therefore really not a surprise that education is at the heart of the Sustainable Development Agenda that is set for 2030. Next slide, thank you. So just quick background also, the INEE Declaration is the framework, the framing document really for the education agenda within the SDGs. And it makes explicit reference to conflict settings and children in a number of places, 3 of which I've put on the slide. I'm not going to read them there, but it's very, very explicit. So there's really an increased awareness and an increased will to address conflict settings, crisis settings, and the children that are affected by these phenomena. Next slide, please. So there you have the series of 17 goals and a whopping huge number of 169 targets that were adopted in September 2015 by member states, covering a gamut of issues from poverty, economic growth, industry, infrastructure, food security, and of course education. Next slide. So the education agenda is most explicit in goal number 4. It's still, as I said earlier, is quite central to the entire 2030 agenda for sustainable development. As within each of the other, well not each, but many of the other goals, there are a number of education-related targets and or indicators, including health and well-being. So where target 3.7 is explicit and mentions the importance of education. Perfect. Gender equality also has as a target that's specific to education. Decent work and economic growth, responsible consumption and growth, and climate change mitigation as well have specific targets. So the kind of goals and targets that are most relevant, in my opinion, to INEE's conflict-sensitive education are goals 10 and 16. So goal 10 aims to reduce inequalities because there's growing consensus that economic growth is not sufficient to reduce poverty if it's not inclusive and if it does not involve economic, environmental, and social development. So that means that equitable access to social services, including education, are extremely important. To reduce inequality, policies need to be universal and pay attention to the needs of disadvantaged and marginalized populations, including those affected by conflict. So for goal 16, peace, justice, and effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions are the focus. Many countries are still faced by armed conflict and violence, and too many people obviously struggle as a result of the weak institutions and the lack of access to justice, information, and other fundamental freedoms. So particularly relevant to education systems is the fact that various forms of violence against children are pervasive, including discipline measures and practices that rely on physical punishment and psychological aggression. So if we look more closely at the education goal, goal 4, which aims to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all, there are 7 outcome targets that cover essentially all of the subsectors of education, ranging from early childhood to higher education. And there's a specific outcome target on citizenship education for sustainable development, including, among others, let's see if I can do this in one breath, Through education for sustainable development and sustainable lifestyles, human rights, gender equality, promotion of a culture of peace and nonviolence, I can't do it, global citizenship, and appreciation of cultural diversity and of culture's contribution to sustainable development. I think you see the opening. So there are also targets around means of implementation, safe and inclusive learning environments, scholarships for higher education, and teacher training and working conditions. From my perspective, next slide please, the targets that are most relevant to conflict-sensitive education are 4.5, 4.7, and 4.8. So 4.5, some of the potential strategies, they're on gender equality, include having education policies, sector plans, and budgets that guarantee inclusion and equality, and ensure that the initiatives implemented in the countries are responding to the needs of affected populations, including those obviously in conflict and crisis situations. For Target 7, strategies might include, for example, using sustainable materials for rebuilding schools and transmitting knowledge and skills that lead to social cohesion, and like our colleague in the earlier session from Angola mentioned, to reconciliation as well. Finally, the target for the means of implementation around learning environments can be reached through developing comprehensive, inclusive policies that promote norms of safe buildings and ensure that systems and schools are safe and violence-free, and that protect children on the way to school and home. So quickly, I'll just present some of the key features of SDG 4, of the education goal. And these are some of the differences in terms of the new kind of innovative aspects of this goal. So in terms of the principles, the globally shared concern for sustainability implies that the agenda is universal and it's relevant to all societies in the global north as well as in the global south. In applying to all the countries in the world, the new global agenda is also based on the principle, as are the conflict-sensitive education principles, that education is a fundamental human right and an enabling right. And it also considers education as a public good, seeing education as a shared societal endeavor, which implies an inclusive process of public policy formulation and implementation. The scope has been significantly broadened, focusing on all subsectors. And the agenda offers a holistic approach to education and stresses the importance of lifelong learning. All age groups, including adults, should have opportunities to learn and continue learning. There's also a renewed focus on equity, focusing on inclusion, equity, and particularly gender equality. And importantly, there's also a focus on quality, looking at effective learning and the acquisition of basic competencies. Another innovative aspect of the SDG agenda is that there's a focus on the relevance of learning, and I'll talk in a minute about how that's also an opportunity for CSE. So let's just look at some of these features in the next slide, please, and the practical implications that they have really for education in general, but also for CSE. So because it's a universally relevant agenda, it's a collective commitment of all countries, regardless of their level of development, which has implications for patterns of collaboration, cooperation, and coordination among stakeholders across and within countries. Another aspect or implication of this is to the interlinkages between the SDGs require going beyond the silo approach. So it's not just educationalists that are speaking to educationalists, but also you're speaking to other ministries, for example, those responsible for disaster, risk management, refugee affairs, architecture, building infrastructure, for example, or even migration departments. The fact that this global agenda is rights-based and a public good also implies inclusive an inclusive process and necessitates an inclusive process of planning and public policy formulation and implementation. The scope and the breadth of the scope aims, as I said, to expand to all levels of education, and it a more sector-wide approach to education policy planning and programming. And the lifelong learning focus also requires a system of recognition and validation, certification of learning competencies, of learning acquisitions that is particularly problematic often in situations of crisis, and poses significant challenges both to students and to teachers. So the focus on equity also, as I mentioned before, implies an inclusive policy dialogue that allows for diverse constituencies to have a greater voice in decision-making processes, and this is also something that is pushed in the CSE, and it strengthens also the legitimacy of national education policy choices, insofar as it offers this opportunity for inclusion of marginalized or minority groups who often have grievances, gives them the opportunity to voice their concern. Almost lastly, the focus on relevant learning requires fair and more balanced mechanisms for capturing and validating knowledge, skills, and competencies across a broader spectrum of learners' expectations, and greater flexibility in assessment practice. This, in my opinion, opens the door for addressing the psychosocial needs of children affected by conflict, but it also opens the door to including skills and knowledge that foster social cohesion and aspects of reconciliation. So, to end, I just wanted to leave you with this quote that is actually from UNESCO's Constitution, because as the SDGs are a return to the kind of humanistic approach to development, I thought the quote is quite inspiring, and it's really an idea that is fundamental to both the CSE and the SDGs. So it highlights the role that education can play to bring peace to the world and also contribute to sustainable development.
Thank you, Leonora, for putting the idea of conflict-sensitive education in a much wider international debate and discourse of development and education. Okay, maybe we could invite a couple of questions for those two presentations, even clarification of some of the things that were said. So if you have a question, please raise your hand. So many questions that you can choose one, is that it? Yeah, please. Maybe you could also tell us which presenter you would like to address to.
Okay, I'm Andrea with INEE. I was wondering, because, and I think this will build, the next presentations will build on my question. It's like, how long does it take for you to be sure that a program is indeed conflict sensitive? No, because we were talking about this not being so, and through these days we were like, it's so hard for you to work on this agenda because it's like it's not tangible. So for your experience, how long until we know that we are in the right track to have a conflict sensitive program or policy? Like, I don't need like a month, or it's just how long is just to tell us about the process and some indicators or.
You mean how long it takes to see whether the program is doing its job in terms of conflict-sensitive education? Okay, would you like to address that question to which one would you like to address that question to?
I think maybe the end, because I think that maybe the Emily's presentation, for example, will help us to understand that.
Okay.
I think who also has a question.
Okay.
And also, it's good that as we integrate in the program, the
push for evidence base as this is intangible. How do you put this as to present to the donors the evidence from the professors?
We had actually a huge discussion on what evidence means in the last couple of days.
Maybe if I may just say a little bit about this evidence. I think since I joined
the working group of INEE, this is the first time that INEE meeting takes place in the university. If I'm not wrong. Yeah.
Since you joined.
That's right. Yeah. The professor, Julio Santos, and I will be actually doing one research component of the training of CAC that INEE will facilitate, and we'll be looking at the how those big concepts, conflict-sensitive education concepts, are adapted and contextualized. So we'll be looking at it as a part of the research endeavor, and we'll be happy to share the results maybe early next year. Okay.
Can I
please?
Just okay, just trying to answer to your question, and on the basis of my modest experience, I would say that when you design an emergency program, it's the first step where you can design it, integrating at the level of the principles, the basics, all the issues that have been listed here. So at this very basic stage, you can already work quite a lot in order to integrate in the definition, in the frame, in the modus operandi of your program, all these principles. So first step. Afterwards, when you bring it into action, I mean when it becomes operational, you can assess how this integration works, and you can make some tests on a regular basis. I would say on an annual basis, because you need time to see how it works and how it expresses, because what I find interesting in my experience is that the principles are there, but the outcomes might be very different according to the situations and according also to the individuals. And so you have always the possibility to integrate the feedback you receive, reinforcing some topics or eliminating some disturbing elements. And I'm going to give you a very stupid and maybe funny example. When we designed our emergency scholarship program for Syrian students, so higher education level, and when we were thinking about the accommodation, it's very basic, but I think these very nice principles express in very anodyne things. And so we were discussing the accommodation, and as you all know, our residencies are based on a sharing rooms. So we thought, let's put the Syrian students together, because maybe like that they can recreate small homes and feel more comfortable. And we were in a way, let's say, replicating our own way of living this situation. And some days after they arrived, I start receiving lots of requests. May I change my room? Because maybe if I have a Portuguese student, I can improve the language. And I thought, wow, 3 days in Portugal and they want already to learn Portuguese to that extent. And actually, one of the main reasons was that, this is at least my interpretation, due to the conflict in their country, they were not able to trust their compatriots. Because if you come from a country where there is a civil war, at the end of the day, it's normal that maybe you have to share your room with someone who supports another option, political option. So it's normal that you feel afraid that during your sleep you are not in a safe environment.
So we had to adapt very quickly this way of shaping the accommodation topic. It seems very anodyne, but it's a very simple example to show that during the implementation of your program, you can assess these small things and correct them as soon as possible. Of course, this is very basic, but it gives you an example how you can operate in practical terms. Thank you.
Thank you. Very concrete example. I think it's very important to include the component of always evaluating, but monitoring and adapting the things that you find out in the process of implementing a program. So maybe we could move on to next two sets of presentations, and starting with the Miss Emily Echesa. Should I say Echesa, right? From the Save the Children. So Emily, would you like to?
Thank you very much for inviting me to Portugal. It's my first time here, and I'm happy to be here representing Save the Children. Save the Children is a non-government organization, an international organization that works in over 120 countries. There is a lot in our website that you can learn about Save the Children, a lot of resources, but today I'm going to talk about a big project that we have in Ethiopia. We have many projects in Ethiopia, but this is just one of the multi-million pounds projects where we've actually done some conflict-sensitive work. And I'll tell you more about it. So I need to move the mouse. Good. So in my presentation, I'll give you a few details about the project and then talk about training we did on conflict-sensitive education in relation to the materials Nina shared and the challenges that we had in that context, the lessons we learned, and then maybe just share some selected outcomes or some results of the midline. We've just completed the end line of the entire project. The context is a pastoralist context with some agro-pastoralist communities. This is known as an emerging region or the developing regional state of Ethiopia. And because it's an emerging region, that means that it's one of the marginalized regions nationally compared to some of the other regions. It's characterized by frequent drought, floods, disease outbreaks, and interclan conflicts, not to the magnitude of the conflicts that we see all over the world, but conflicts that affect the normal life of some of the Somali people. And that's why we use a conflict-sensitive education approach in this pocket of minor conflict in a relatively stable country. The population is 5.3 million by 2012, males being more than the females, 56 to 44%. The average household size is 6.6, and the primary education enrollment rate that we started was 63.7 compared to 92.2 nationally. Gender parity is 0.90 compared to 0.93 nationally. Just a few details of the project before I get into the CSE training. This is support to the provision of basic services in the Somali region in Ethiopia. It's within our peace and development program called BASIS PDP. It's essentially the large name. As you heard about the acronyms, we love them. It's about £31 million funded by DFID. You heard about the percentages allocated to education in humanitarian aid. This happens in projects as well. So out of 31 million, we have about 2.3 million for the education sector, because this is an integrated project of education, health, and water, health, and sanitation. The project started in 2013 to January 2017. It ended this year. But before the project was implemented, a one-year project called Bridges within the same region, which was like a pilot, and then we got a one-year extension, and within those 2 years we realized if we don't use a conflict-sensitive education lens or a conflict-sensitive overall framework, we were not making much progress. That's why we started with a conflict-sensitive framework in the next phase from 2013 to 2017. Working in 15 districts, targeting 1.1 million population. It's a consortium project with Save the Children as the lead for the education component, International Rescue Committee, IRC, SABS, and Islamic Relief, and a local organization called PAUDA, Organization for Welfare and Development in Action. It's an education, health, and WASH project, as I said earlier. And just to give you a picture and a sense of the 15 districts and how they're distributed, looking at the hotspots and where each consortium member was programming. The focus for the outputs of the projects, one was to strengthen capacity of government officials, including frontline workers, to plan and deliver conflict-sensitive education services. Communities, capacity strengthened to be more effectively engaged in service provision, and the third was to improve provision of good quality inputs and that enhances quality of basic services. That includes education, health, and WASH. So as you can see, it's a very huge integrated project where I'm going to zero down just to education, and within education, I will zero down to just one small training that we did for the project staff that had an impact on different aspects of the project on conflict sensitivity, among many other trainings on quality of education and technical trainings. So the outcome we expected was a visible, equitable improvements in sustainable delivery of the WASH education and health component, and an impact of contributing to a more stable and inclusive Somali region. We've heard about marginalized communities and focusing on inclusivity and all those other things. So the activities for, some of the activities, not all, for the education component were construction and renovation of schools, because as I said earlier, a lot of children were not in school because it's a pastoralist communities, they are mobile communities, they move from one place to the other, they compete for very scarce resources, grazing land, water, that raises tensions and eventually skirmishes and that erupt into slightly conflicts. Looking at reading corners to bring materials and local materials to the children, networking cards to enable the children move from one school to the other safely, even through the different districts, especially when they are moving with their cattle and their livestock and their families, so that they don't drop out of school entirely. Capacity building of regional education bureaus, water education bureaus who are the districts, Kabeles are the villages, and community groups, parents, teachers associations, teachers and even children and youth groups, community mobilization. So getting into the conflict-sensitive education training, these are the project staff that went through the training, and as you can see, the gender experts will notice something very quickly that we'll talk about later. Our theory of change for that training itself was that if BASIS, which is the education, the basic services component of the bigger project, if BASIS education project staff are trained on conflict-sensitive education, they will then utilize the skills and knowledge gain to cascade and train all the education officials at the different decentralized levels. The teachers, they'll be able to mobilize communities better without creating more tensions, implement activities from a conflict-sensitive perspective. As a result of this, we'll get increased female and male children attending schools and alternative basic education centers, and complete with good learning outcomes. So between 30th June and 1st July 2014, we trained in Gidiga. All the project staff came from the different districts. Gidiga is the center of Somali region. with the aim of them understanding conflict-sensitive education in order to apply it in project implementation and monitoring. And then we went back again in 2012, or I went back again in 2015, from 12th to 16th October, and we had a refresher training, which the staff were demanding during all the TA visits that were there, to review and reflect on the project, and also so that they're able to analyze and be able to better report and include gender sensitivity in the work. Because as you were training, gender came up and you had to do an additional training in gender. The use of training, we trained 19 staff, 2 of them were female project staff, 15 education officers, 3 technical managers, 1 technical lead. And after the training, they went out to their respective districts and trained 83, out of which were 13 females who were district education officials and cluster supervisors. And for the refresher course, we trained 16. The females had dropped out due to high staff turnover and other members, but the 16, most of them were some of the staff who were in the first training. This is a bit complicated, but this is just to show you how the tool, the reflection tool that Nina was showing you was constantly used by the staff as they went to the field to find out what are the issues. For example, the first box, they found out that in some of the schools they sent teachers, they had sent teachers who spoke Somali, and these were Oromia communities. So that in itself started creating a little tension, so they had to quickly learn lessons, reflect, and send in teachers who spoke the language of the community they were working with there, because they had assumed the entire region was just one community. Challenges of the training, the timing, it was Ramadan period, most staff were fasting, so we needed to build a lot of time for early morning prayer. We would start early, finish very early, and have less time for the training. The energizers, of course, when we used the energizers, the case studies, some of them did not work well, but the local way of energizing during Ramadan is telling jokes, comedy, so there was a lot of comedy throughout the training so that staff can retain their energy and manage their hunger. The language used was English. Most of the project staffs could speak English but could understand more in their local language. So training in translations, we used double time, a lot of minis from the CSC pack, not in translation, but we were able to catch up with that. Then the gender balance, I've talked about that before. There were no females in the second training. It was really challenging to get females in Somali region who were in the projects because of the context. And capacity of participants, it was also important to make sure that whoever attends was able to grasp the content of the CSC training. And then initially there was some resistance to the entire title of conflict-sensitive education because staff felt that they were not in a conflict zone and this was not relevant to them. But as we started working through it, they realized that using a conflict-sensitive approach, even at design through projects, the project cycle, implementation, evaluation, you can prevent conflicts from taking place. Lessons learned certification, we gave them certificates from INEE, and this kind of inspired them to even go more to the field and apply conflict-sensitive education into the work. And then linking the theory to field visits, the first training was in the workshop, the second was in a workshop setting, but we had a day out in the field where they actually used the tools to reflect and speak to communities, visit schools, and find out whether their conflict-sensitive education training was being applied in the work that they were doing. And we found out a lot of interesting things. Then the gender balance and representation in the trainings and even in the projects in some context is just a challenge. And we have to live with that and work harder as we move on to improve that. Contextualization of CSE training content. It's important also to use local examples because most of the examples in the pack were of some violent conflicts and conflicts that are of high magnitude, but these are conflicts that are clan level and community level. So we had to tone down some of the examples to make sure that the staff are related in the content within. So from our midline, we saw that the baseline of enrollment was 45,000 children, but this increased to about 98,000. And by midline, it was 103, with 103,000 children, with females also percentages growing by about 8%, from 43% to 35%. And this is how our classroom looks currently compared to when we started in 2013, where there were small gains at that time. And in the midline report, the conclusion in some of the sections was that 67% of the work that developed and strengthened operational plans were heavily informed by the communities, which meant that because of working with communities from design through the project cycle and engaging them fully, they engaged even in developing their own plans. And this brought about transparency, accountability, and has led to improved dialogue, reduced resource-related conflicts, and increasing trust in the government. And the services, of course, to the underserved, because there are places that the government had not reached. But now, through this project and the conflict-sensitive approach, the government is able to reach very many places. And this year, we are going to hand over a project to the government to continue, of course, probably funded by DFID. And finally, the overall lessons, conflict-sensitive programming actually mitigates conflict. So we do agree by what we saw in this project. CSC approach must be applied in programming in all contexts, not just conflict or crisis-affected contexts. This actually should be a programming tool, even for development, not just a crisis. Contextualization of CSC is critical before rolling it out because of the examples I gave earlier. And then the continuous monitoring and refresher trainings of staff to consolidate and apply the learning is important. A one-off training will not work. It's important to go back for a refresher and to keep on incorporating this into the technical assistance that we provide to the countries to make sure that design and implementation follows that pattern. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Emily. This is an excellent example of the integration of CAC into the training of stakeholders. It highlights the importance of this approach, not just in the societies with the outbreak of big violence, but also in even more stable societies. I also appreciate Emily's explanation about the adaptation, contextualization of the CAC concept. Makes me think that you have to be sensitive when you introduce a CAC into programming. Thank you. Let's move on to the last presentation by Ms. Helena Barroco of the Global Platform for Syrian Students.
Okay, thank you. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. I would like to start by thanking the organizers for inviting us to be here today. And we are very happy to share with you our experience in setting up an emergency scholarship program for Syrian students. And to start with and to re-energize a little bit this audience, I will start with a short film with 3 testimonials of students.
education offers a real home to young women and men during crisis situations. It increases resilience and
Okay, so I will change the order while they are trying to fix the technical problems. I'm very sorry about that. And I will start by saying that you have heard this morning about the SDG agenda and mainly on SDG 4 on education. This morning you have heard the session before about education in emergencies. And I would like to introduce the World Humanitarian Summit, which took place the last year in May, which has, let's say, framed the question of education within the refugee crisis. A third element that I would like to bring here is the New York Declaration, which was adopted in September last year, and which introduces a new, let's say, commitment by the international community focused on higher education in emergencies, which is, allow me the expression, my cup of tea, or I would say my fight for some time now. Why I'm stressing this point? Because thanks to the previous Millennium Development Goals agenda, thanks to the intense advocacy and action by various international NGOs such as Save the Children, primary education is very much at the center of the international agenda, although we know lots of efforts have still to be done, because we have seen this morning some figures which are really appalling. However, education is a continuum, and if you want to have primary education with quality, you cannot forget higher education, because teachers need to have some kind of higher education. So if you broke the cycle, the chain, you have problems. What has happened until very recently is that higher education was really neglected, not only in the context of development, because one of the main, let's say, breakthrough of the SDGs agenda is to include higher education and scholarships for higher education, as you have mentioned, but also because higher education is now part of the commitments made and expressed in this New York Declaration. So now we have a framework to ask for action, and we are, let's say, entitled to ask that deeds are matched, words are matched with deeds. So strongly making the case for higher education in emergencies. And I don't know if you have noticed, but it was mentioned, among refugees, only 1% has access to higher education. When you take the example of Syria, before the war, 25% of students finalizing secondary school with their baccalaureate, they have access to higher education. So you see the gap, 25% and 1%. This means if you don't do anything, we are producing lost generation of university graduates. And this is really important, because if you think of a conflict, you think of a destroyed country. If you think of a destroyed country, you have to think of rebuilding it. And if you don't prepare the next generation of leaders, you will produce failed states. So it is really extremely important to develop further efforts focused on higher education, without forgetting, of course, the other levels. So all levels have to be energized and have to be promoted. Having said that, we here in Portugal, and I'm very proud of it, because this was an initiative by the Portuguese government, led by our former President of the Republic, Mr. Jorge Sampaio, in 2013, when the refugee crisis in Europe was still a very far away thing and was not yet in the headlines, we decided to develop an emergency scholarship program for Syrian students. We have called emergency program, but actually the idea was to create a program which was conflict sensitive. So I will explain in a moment that we have incorporated the points within our program. We developed this program on the basis of the best practices available, having as partners IIE, who of course had already a very solid experience with the Iraqi crisis, but also with other partners such as the Council of Europe, the League of Arab States and others. And so we have structured our program with three pillars: an academic consortium, a network of partners and an emergency fund. And believe me, we started opening an account with 20 euros. We started our program like that, and after, of course, we have raised lots of funds. But this is only to show you that when we want, we manage to do things, even with 20 euros as a starting point. I will not bother you with details about the development and the design of the program. I would like only to tell you that we have created an NGO to manage this program and have all the rules of transparency, etc., good management. But we created this NGO in 2013, in November, and in March 2014 we were able to invite the first pilot group of students to Portugal. 45 is micro program, but step by step we believe a change can happen. I'm happy to see someone who was part of this pilot experience among our audience, and I'm also very happy to see that another student who integrated the second group is also there. Or it was half the first, half the second, because of bureaucratic reasons. And now we have 150 students. I must say that the most rewarding thing is to see that students are now starting completing their degrees. Yesterday, maybe you have seen in the newspaper Public, there was a small story about a student who had finished civil engineering, a master's degree in Aveiro, with 18. So it was like a celebrity at the university, and he has already a job. So this is the most rewarding thing, and I'm very happy to see that things move smoothly. And now I would like to show you only some testimonials about the impact of this program, because it's not only the lives of the students, but it's the whole family and the community also. My second part of the presentation, to cut short long stories, will be focused on how we are progressing from addressing the Syrian crisis through our modest efforts, how we are trying to enlarge and strategize our scholarship program, how we are moving also to discuss with partners how to address this topic in a sustainable and systemic way. And so the second point will be on a concept that we have been developing, on setting up a rapid response mechanism for higher education in emergencies. So the film is ready, and as a kind of an entertainment moment, please enjoy these testimonials.
Higher education offers a real home to young women and men during crisis situations. It increases resilience and gives hope for the future. Yet, in emergencies, higher education is too often misunderstood and neglected.
We lost our chances in Syria. I tried to complete my study there, but the situation get worse.
Things got very desperate, and I said, I'm gonna give up. Whatever is gonna happen, just let it happen. And you know when you get desperate.
Yeah, I don't know, it was like a gift. Along 4 years and a half, I fighting a lot. You can't imagine, with my family, with the universities, with life. So it's my dream, I will not quit. I will never give up. I'm a dentist. I'm here to complete my postgraduate study.
I'm an architect and I'm studying master's degree in urban planning. Interiors for me, it's like a passion. They have areas are free, everything damaged, everything restored. That's a bad thing, but we can have some life in that we can build something new, something more modern.
I'm a mechanical engineer and I'm studying robotics at Braga University in Portugal. All of my friends who are graduated like me from university, they do not believe in violence. Educated people do not believe in violence. I do not think anybody is going to carry a weapon and sacrifice his life unless he didn't find any other opportunity to contribute to humanity.
I am an electrical engineer and I'm studying a master in renewable energy. It has always been my dream to complete my study. As girl, it's opportunity for complete study and also to be a tough girl. It's really because now I become independent girl to work, to be involved in society. We all want to come back. That's why we are maintaining to be students, and we are not running away from the war. No, we are trying to face it by our education.
Knowledge, it's a weapon, it's the smart weapon, a peaceful weapon. And I wish every student who really want to complete research to get this chance. Food is important, safety is important, and life expenses, it's very important. But in the meantime, we should not forget to build these children. If you build the person, you build the community will build the country.
Okay, so I would like just to stress three statements by students. One said, we are not fleeing the war, we are facing it through our education. I think it's really that matters. Another one said that if we build a person, the person will build the community, and the community will build the country. And I really think that this is the dynamics that we are looking for when we are trying to create these academic opportunities. Now, reflecting on our program, I have brought some leaflets, so if you want to know more about the details of the program, you can consult or take these leaflets or consult our website or ask questions through email after the sessions. So I will not enter into details on how we have built the program, how it is developing, and what are, let's say, our first assessment. But I would like rather to focus on the need to really address this problem from a systemic and sustainable perspective in order to be able to do more, to do better, and to do faster. And I think here it's very important to underline this element. Because looking again at the Syrian crisis, when you see that the war enters its 6th year, this means enough time for a whole generation to be graduated during the war. So you see the time we are wasting, the lost generations we are creating because of our inaction. So looking at the ways we can build this mechanism, the first thing that we want to underline is that there is no need to reinvent the wheel. And for the tertiary level, for the university level, universities know what to do. So they only need to be supported in terms of coordination, in terms of linking to the humanitarian actors, and have some funds available. Because starting with 20 euros, it's not a solution, okay? Although I have mentioned that as let's say, a big topic. So we have been thinking about how to do it. We are now working on developing this concept and on setting up coalitions of partners able to run a pilot with us. I am also pleased to underline that IIE, so the Institute of International Education, based in New York or Washington in the USA, they have started creating what is called a PEER, a platform for education in emergencies response, which is a kind of a clearing house, collecting the various opportunities available, now for Syrians, but in the future for all refugees. And we will now see how this can connect as a component of this rapid response mechanism. So I'm glad to invite you all to join our efforts. I am very thankful to the University of Minho, who is part of the global platform since day one. We have here 15 students from our platform, and I will close my intervention with an animation film on this rapid response mechanism, because it's very graphic. It gives you the idea how this solution will also involve the whole community. So thank you, and let's now see the film.
113 were displaced from their homes. In 2015, 65.3 million people, or 1 person in 113, were displaced from their homes due to conflict and persecution or because of natural disasters. Regretfully, war, not peace, has momentum, and since 2010, each year has seen more conflict, more victims, and more people displaced. With more than 35 conflicts going on, the situation will not stop or be reversed soon. Among refugees, 51% are young people who are less than 18 years old. The average time they stay in camp is 17 years. Providing refugees and displaced people with life-saving aid is a moral duty and an international obligation. But there's more than that. Ask parents in refugee camps what they want for their children. They all seek the same thing first: education. In emergency situations, education at all levels matters. Education makes a real difference. Most parents' dream is that their children go to university. The same goes for young people. And yet, higher education is too often neglected. Only 1% of refugees have access to higher education. The others are left behind, vulnerable, hopeless. What a waste. We have to turn this tide. How can we do more, better, and faster? As hospitals have emergency services, education should also have emergency programs. So let's set up a rapid response mechanism for higher education in emergencies. No need to reinvent the wheel. Universities are used to hosting foreign students and scholars to exchange programs and mobility. So let's put them at the centre of the rapid response mechanism. Integrating refugees and other forcibly displaced students is not that fundamentally different from integrating any other student. Now, to make it work in emergencies, we need to remove barriers that refugees face to accessing higher education, including lack of information, advice and individual guidance sensitive to their specific needs. To address these issues, we need to set up a coordination facility. A combination of online state-of-the-art solutions and tools, plus a small team able to manage, coordinate and provide an effective emergency academic response. And indeed, we need a financing facility. For that, we have to bring together some donors who will make an endowment, and we can raise a solidarity levy within the global academic community. If each student gives $1, we will make more than 230 million per year. That's it. Our rapid response mechanism is working now. We can do more, better, and faster. What a difference. Let's make education become a true catalyst for recovery. Let's prepare a new generation of leaders who will be responsible for rebuilding war-torn countries. The great Einstein, he too was a refugee. Let's follow in his footsteps. Let's build hope for the future. Together, we can make it happen.
Thank you very much, Elena. Thank you for the highlighting the importance of higher education in emergency context, which is a bit neglected area, I suppose. But I think it's important that when a crisis is over, they need people who could help rebuild the society. So really appreciate that you talked about this higher education. Okay, I think we're running out of time. Yes. Around 10 minutes. Okay. 5 minutes. Okay. We have 5 minutes. Is okay? Sure. Okay. All right. So we have 10 minutes for the question and answer discussion time. So if you have questions or requests for clarification, our presenters will be happy to respond. Please, yeah. So Minho has a response to previous question. Yeah.
So just as you're thinking of your next questions, I wanted to respond to a couple of the questions that were asked earlier about indicators and how do we present the evidence to donors. I'll start with the latter. First, I want to recall that donors committed to the Paris Declaration on Aid Effectiveness 5 various commitments, of which include do no harm principles and approach. And so I don't think that there's a need to justify a conflict-sensitive approach when designing and seeking support from donors. I think that donors have already made that commitment through various other mechanisms, namely the Paris Declaration. However, what I think is still needed and what I would encourage partners and organizations to do is to make very explicit the ways in which you have already done an assessment of the conflict or risks in the environment in which you're working, and to make explicit in applications or in your approaches how your choice of interventions, how the activities you're choosing, and how your monitoring and evaluation plan is going to either redress risks, mitigate conflict, and reduce other risks, but also that the assumptions that are often laid out in your logical framework or your monitoring and evaluation plan actually include specific indicators to monitor those assumptions. Because those assumptions, as Helen gave a great example about, those assumptions will change and are based on a certain understanding and based on your analysis of the context. And oftentimes, we see that this link between the analysis and understanding of the environment is often disjointed from the approach or implementation and activities that are going to be implemented. And I think that greater work and partnership needs to go into bringing those aspects together. In terms of indicators, I think that there's a variety and other ways, a variety of approaches to evaluate and look at the how we're being conflict sensitive and when we know we're being conflict sensitive. First, I think that disaggregation of all indicators is a key element and an aspect of measuring equity in all aspects of a program. So it's not, there is no one indicator, but it's in fact about how are you disaggregating based on the analysis and your understanding of who is marginalized. How are you going to make sure that you're disaggregating, whether it's the number of textbooks distributed, whether it's the languages that you're developing those textbooks in, whether it's the geographic locations that you're working in, but disaggregation of indicators often we see is not included in as a very simple disaggregation of male and female participants, let alone other marginalized groups. And we all need to be committed to greater data disaggregation so that we can better monitor conflict-sensitive aspects. And finally, another approach that I think increasingly is looking at evaluation frameworks and methodologies that help us to look at the broader context in which we're working and how we're making choices and pivots and adapting. So such approaches like developmental evaluation, which is an approach developed by Michael Quinn Patton, can help us to document and better map out the ways in which our programs are being flexible and responsive to the conflict dynamic in which they're working.
Thank you, Nina. Thank you. Okay, so does anybody have any questions and clarifications? Request for clarification. Yes. As much as you like.
It's because I'm really interested in conflict-sensitive education. It's a question to Emily. Emily, within your program, you talked about the resistance to conflict-sensitive education, and I think we feel the same in our the countries that we work with. When you say the word conflict, it's like, what? No. So, from your experience, what strategies did you use to go around this resistance?
Thank you so much, Andres. I think that's a very good question because people tend to see conflict as what is happening in Syria and Afghanistan and DRC or what happened in other countries, but not close to home. But it's really important to, as you're using the CSE path, to gradually unpack what is happening in the local context. As I said, the example I provided today is a pocket of tensions and conflict within a relatively stable country. So there's the overall resistance of the nationals to say this country cannot be, a conflict-affected country because we are in a different category. But you also have to begin unpacking with your project staff to find out what are the issues that are happening on the ground. Because when you use the CSE part, the first thing you begin doing is analyzing the context with the local communities, with the project staff, with the youth. Everybody has to be involved in finding out what are the challenges that we are having. And as you unpack that, you realize, oh yes, this CSE approach can actually help us mitigate some of the issues that are taking place within our communities. Because you find there are districts that the project staff could not go to. Either they woke up in the morning and found something happened, or they delivered resources and those resources could not get to the target communities because of a situation that has occurred either in the day or in the night. And it's important for them to understand those situations and unpack them from their perspective. So it doesn't have to be conflict in the broader concept, but begin from what they know about their own conflicts. If it's clan conflicts, are they conflicts in the first place? So they need to understand that themselves. Yeah.
Okay, no further questions or even comments, maybe? Yeah.
Just a comment. Thanks. Nina mentioned that measuring or disaggregating data is a really important aspect of understanding how to be conflict sensitive. But we don't often always have good metrics for how to measure different equity dimensions in these contexts. So I just want everyone to know that there is an initiative called the Education Equity Research Initiative that if you go to educationequity2030.org, there's a lot of work being done right now by organizations around the world to try to standardize equity metrics and do a lot of other research on how to better understand equity dimensions in education, directly aligned with the SDGs. So I think there is some really good, interesting work on measurement that's happening right now. Just so everybody knows, and you're welcome to talk to me about it later if you have questions.
Thank you. One more question. Is that information contained in the INEE's website? Is it possible to go to that website from that INEE website?
That's a good question. Is it on?
Yes.
Yes. I'm not actually sure if it's linked directly to the INEE website. Does anyone know the answer to that?
Not yet.
I think it's a brand new, it's a very new website, but educationequity2030.org. You can find out more, and we should link that, Dean.
Right. Actually, that's I was proposing. All right. Thank you for the intervention. It's useful information that people can use. Okay. With that, we have to finish the second session. Professor Julio dos Santos has so much trust in me to organize the session and finish it on time. As a Japanese, I'm not supposed to be good at failing, to be honest. I'm sorry. But I think our presentators give you lots of food for thoughts. So you'll enjoy the real lunch food, but at the same time, food for thoughts. Then you could participate actively in the afternoon session. All right, and thank you very much. Obrigado, narigato, and please give a big applause to our presentators. Thank you very much.
Sorry, 2 more minutes about the afternoon session. So I will say it in Portuguese first, so that I think that INEE members are more aware of the afternoon. So I will explain it in Portuguese, ok? Então, só convidamos para ficarem para a sessão da tarde, porque na nossa perspectiva será um momento em que podemos ter uma participação mais direta. Os momentos que criamos, a proposta é dividir-nos em 3 grupos temáticos, em que nós possamos conversar com algumas pessoas sobre a sua própria experiência, trazermos as nossas aprendizagens e conversarmos um pouco sobre de que maneira é que as organizações que estarão juntas nestes grupos de discussão podem criar sinergias. Que tipo de sinergias é que podemos desenvolver, colaborações. Então convidar-vos de facto a ficar para o período da tarde para que possam ter esta conversa mais direta com alguns dos intervenientes que tivemos no período da manhã. Explicar-vos, quem estiver consciente do grupo de discussão em que se inscreveu, perfeito. Pode ir para a sala em que eu vou explicar de seguida. Se não se recordam que grupo de discussão é que se inscreveram, eu vou relembrá-los e podem escolher um agora, está bem? Quem se lembra? Perfeito. Quem não se lembra, não faz mal. Escolham. Então, o primeiro grupo, que ficará nesta sala, a partir das 2h30, das 14h30, é sobre ensino, formação, capacitação sobre educação em situação de emergência. Então, vamos ter um contributo da revista científica sobre educação em situação de emergência, a Escola de Arquitetura e a Escola de Medicina, nesta sala, a partir das 14h30. O segundo grupo é sobre investigação e gestão de conhecimento, também dentro desta área. E a sala é o auditório multimédia, a sala de dados, peço desculpa, que é no primeiro andar deste edifício. Vocês vão encontrar indicações. Sala de dados, grupo 2 sobre gestão de conhecimento e investigação. Vamos ter, peço desculpa, há pouco cometi um erro, vamos ter a Mary Manhall no primeiro grupo. A revista científica aqui é na sala de dados. E também o contributo do professor José Carlos Morgado e do professor Júlio sobre o programa de doutoramento aqui do Instituto de Educação, e o Paulo Frisoli do International Rescue Committee também nos vai falar um pouco de uma experiência relacionada com a investigação e gestão de conhecimento. Finalmente, isto que eu acabei de dizer lá em cima na sala de dados. Mas vocês vão encontrar sinalização. Finalmente, o grupo 3, que é um pouco sobre agendas e tendências atuais, o que é que está em voga dentro desta área de educação em situação de emergência. Vamos ter o contributo da União Europeia, também da World Vision e do IEP. A Leonora vai estar connosco neste grupo também. E neste caso, a sala vai ser moderada pelo Pete Sims, da Children in Crisis, e a sala é o auditório pequeno. A indicação que vocês vão encontrar é auditório, mas basicamente onde estávamos no coffee break, no final do corredor, percorrem o corredor todo e vão encontrar a indicação. Ok? Às 14h30, por favor, venham, porque eu acho que vai ser extremamente interessante para criarmos sinergias. Obrigada, bom almoço.